Welcome to Virtual Wednesdays. My name is Francesca D'Alessio, and I'm so glad you could join us tonight. Tonight, we are celebrating the closing of the exhibition Calder-Picasso with this special presentation by artist and composer Gryphon Rue. Gryphon will explain how Alexander Calder's invention of the mobile changed music forever, influencing composers to develop new musical forms, strategies, and philosophies. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A with the exhibition curator Timothy Burgard. Tim is the distinguished senior curator and curator in charge of American art here at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. He is the curator of 29 exhibitions and the author and co-author of over 17 books and 9 scholarly articles. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, and I really could go on, but just know he's a wonderful colleague. Please give a warm welcome to Timothy Burgard and Gryphon Rue.
Thank you, Fran, and welcome everyone to another Virtual Wednesday. It is a pleasure to introduce Gryphon Rue, an artist, composer, and curator who works across disciplines. He performs in the audiovisual project Rue Bainbridge and in duo with the sound artist Merche Blasco. Rue organizes exhibitions and events at Drone, a nonprofit art space in New York. He hosts Earmark on Montez Press Radio, and his films are distributed by the Filmmakers Cooperative. His most recent book is Strange Attractor, which takes its name from the inherent order embedded in various forms of chaos. Expanding on ideas and connections forged in his 2017 Ballroom Marfa exhibition of the same name, Strange Attractor explores the uncertainties and poetics of networks. As an experimental sound artist, Rue brings together artists and practitioners from a variety of fields to converse on the chaos, connections, and interpretations that narrate everyday experience. The topic of sound pervades the book as a guide and narrator through a web of increasingly complex relationships between systems, revealing a backdrop of socio-political power, transmigration, and asylum. Please join me in welcoming Gryphon Rue.
Hi, my name is Gryphon Rue. Thank you so much for having me, to everyone at the DeYoung Foundation, and for this very cool opportunity to present for the Calder-Picasso exhibition. My interest is in the sonic arts, in sort of the history of experimentation and multimedia art, and modernism, and postmodernism. So I'm going to kind of give you an abbreviated history of a slice of Calder's use of sound in his work, and specifically how his invention of the mobile would go on to influence sound artists, interdisciplinary sound artists, composers, and people using musical language in the 20th and 21st century. So I don't have a ton of time to do that, approximately 30 to 40 minutes. I've written some texts about this topic in a broader way, just called Calder and Sound, and delivered lectures on the topic in the kind of the grand universe of Calder's use of sound, his relationship with composers, which is still not as well appreciated as it should be. So there's a lot of work to be done, and the history of the sonic arts has a kind of a privileging of white male composers, and you'll see some of that invading into this presentation, which I wanted to point out before I even get started, because there's a kind of dominant and narrative happening through a lot of the European musical and artistic history, and the way that these people are in communication with each other means that you see a certain homogeneous kind of narrative forming. But I'm looking at something very specifically, and in some ways I think that narrative is going to be reshaped in the future. So with that kind of forewarning, let's continue. This is an image that I'm sharing of Calder in his studio in 1944. And there are three gongs in his studio in the rafters. Now, Red Disc and Gong and the Untitled Gongs were objects that accompanied him through his whole work process. He worked in silence in his studio always, and unaccompanied. He had no assistants. So these frequent sounds of clanging metal and noise were something he didn't mind. And the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about one of these gongs, an encounter he had with it, which is kind of interesting, thinking about Calder's relationship with sound and the mobile's later influence on composers and sonic artists. Jean-Paul Sartre described this encounter: "I once saw a beater and gong hanging very high up in Calder's studio. At the slightest draft of air, the beater went after the rotating gong. It would draw back to strike, lash out at the gong, and then, like a clumsy hand, miss. And just when you were least expecting it, it would come straight at it and strike it in the middle with a terrible noise." So this is rather different than a kind of a common perception of Calder's interest in color and playfulness, joy, some of the dominant narratives that we're trying to unpack and look at the complexity of what his interests really were and what he was interested and invested in. There's also an interesting poem by the artist André Masson about the experience of visiting this extraordinary studio with this clutter and this kind of laboratory, this workshop. And so he wrote a poem called The Studio of Alexander Calder, which I'm going to read to you. "Hung from the studio's rafters, in the streaks of light, a gong sensitive to the caprices of air is struck only with the greatest caution. With the step of a dove, it rings. What hour does it sound? This is the hour of bustling centipedes. It is also the hour of the child with the cherries. Here the seconds lack the weight of the clock. They do not rest in the grass. They cannot conceive of immobility. They love the rustling of reeds and the cry of the tree frog who breathes music. They play between your fingers, Calder, my friend." So Calder was born in 1898, and in 1930, when he was 32 years old, he had this extraordinary shift in his artistic vocabulary, and he became fully committed to abstraction. So you can look elsewhere for the details of how that took place. In a nutshell, he visited the studio of the artist Piet Mondrian in the fall of 1930 and was very struck by Mondrian's attitude towards incorporating in a very total way his artistic life with his daily life. And the studio was an extraordinary place. But in the same period, he meets this person who's a composer, 14 years older than Calder. They would become like brothers and develop a lifelong friendship. Edgar Varese is considered the godfather of electronic music. That's his kind of title. And he is fascinating for many reasons, but as it relates to Calder, Calder was interested in Varese's use of noise, and on many levels, they saw kind of a kinship. Calder's wife wrote in a letter to her mom in the spring of 1931 that Varese was visiting Calder because he was fascinated by the correspondence between Calder's objects and Varese's music. So there's a music stand on Varese's table there in that promotional shot. It says, "Hommage à Varese," homage to his friend Varese. And it's this wire stand with some string that should be restored that Calder made for his dear friend. And Varese was friends with many visual artists, including people like Joseph Stella, Juan Miró. And so Calder was very fond of this guy. So here's a clip from a performance of Varese called Ionization. So this piece of music is actually the first piece of music in European Western music that is known for being purely percussive. You'll see a piano being banged in a percussive manner, and it's an early instance where they're using noise in music, really incorporating it in a serious way to the chamber. Right, so there's this extraordinary rebellion going on where Varese is exploring ideas that at the time really existed outside of what was acceptable practice as a composer. In the classical music world, a thing called the sonic arts didn't exist yet. And so he was really innovating music in different ways and resonating with some of Calder's ideas, the younger artist by 14 years. And it's interesting to think about it in the way that they were describing their work, because it was in very visual kind of cosmic language. So this is a sculpture that Calder made called Musique de Varese around that period when he had first befriended Varese. They hadn't even known each other for a year when he made this sculpture. And there's that little black ebony cube on that jagged air strip of tin, which is reflective, so it light bounces off and potentially blinding experience with a tiny little white wooden ball. It's really an amazing work because it describes shapes in different dimensions, so that the two intersecting pieces of wire describe a sphere as well, that you need to imagine that you're kind of penetrating into this pellucid invisible world. And as in a lot of Calder's work, there's a micro and macro thing happening. We don't know what the scale of this really is. It almost just exists conceptually. But Calder would describe his interests as volumes, motion, and spaces bounded by the great space, the universe. And Varese used sort of sculptural language to describe his music. And his way of thinking about writing and notation. So he would borrow from visual arts terminology and crystallography and different practices like that. So I'll quote him. He'll say, "Taking the place of the old fixed linear counterpoint, you will find in my works the movement of masses varying in radiance and of different densities and volumes." He had a composition earlier called Integral from 1924 to 25. And there's this Calder sculpture, Snake and Cross, that really struck me as precisely the way that Varese was describing his music and that Calder described his works of art. So Varese's description of this piece of music, the changing projection of a geometrical figure onto a plane surface. So you can already see that happening with the turning of that rotating shape. With both geometrical figure and plane surface, as in the frame in space, this invisible backdrop to the hanging mobile piece, moving in space. each at its own changing and varying speeds of lateral movement and rotation. And to me, this is just amazing, thinking about a composer and a sculptor who are really on the same track of mind, talking about a kind of liquid evolution of negative space, circumscribed by a frame. This is another mobile that the viewer actually determines its final composition. So those two white bits there are actually mobile, so you can shift which you are looking at from a particular angle. You can take them off of that lateral rod. You can move the rod. That long post is on a pin, so it can shift like that. And once again, it's three different descriptions of a sphere. So I'll come back to this later. Because this concept of mobility and leaving the choice to the audience or to the viewer becomes really important later in music. This was the sculpture, the mobile, that Duchamp placed his hands onto while the paint was still wet in Calder's studio in Paris, and said mobile when Calder asked him what he should call these objects. So we are indebted to Duchamp for the clever term mobile, which is a pun, which means mobility or motion. It also means motive, like a motive for a crime. And so here it is in motion from a show at Pace Gallery. Very, very slow. Some of these motorized works, they move so subtly. There's actually a story of Einstein watching for the entire duration, which was 40-some minutes of one of these motorized works to move before he moved on. And that little square of metal there is another reflective surface. Sort of fascination with incorporating variance. So there's the noise of the motor, which you don't hear actually in this video, but the noise with this light interaction and the color and the idea of all the rods also fading invisibly into the white background. So you're seeing these objects shifting in space, rotating at different speeds. So a real fascination with the disparity in the composition, the disparity between the different materials, the different effects that are happening simultaneously, kind of a description of a subjective or a particular experience, which then becomes a universal experience. And so it's just repeated itself. And so all of this is coming together, and he finally incorporates noise and audience intervention, found recycled materials into one sculpture, into an instrument, into this kind of epochal moment of this first hanging mobile. And it's a chance composition a la John Cage, who would make pieces like Williams Mix more than 20 years later. It's an opportunity for the viewer to arrange those objects on the ground, determining the final composition. You could put it into a line, all the objects in a straight line. All of those objects, apart from the gong, I believe, were found and selected by Calder. They're quite different sonically from one another. You can see the bottles are of different size and shapes, so they produce different pitches. There's the wood box, there's the tin can, there's the brass gong, the different materials. And in 1943, in a very rare instance of Calder revisiting works, and he produced over 23,000 works of art. So a very prolific artist, and yet he very rarely returns to these things. So he's proposing to the curator at MoMA, James Johnson Sweeney, for his retrospective that they could include this work. So there's this drawing at the bottom of this letter describing this piece. So he wants to bring it down and set it up for him to see. I call it the small sphere and heavy sphere. So this is really the origin of so many of the subjects that Calder was involved with. Here's a bit of video of Calder revisiting it again decades later, taking household objects and things he had lying around and experimenting. So it's this kind of pendulum that you push a bar, and then that ball of lead actually is set in motion. And it causes the white ball to move in complicated pendular motions and strike the objects or not strike the objects. Here's with sound.
The challenge now is to give shape to the chromatic intuitions gained in the studio of Mondrian.
Okay, that's just bullshit, so we can move on from that. This is called Une Boule Noire, Une Boule Blanche. This is at the Foundation Mag in France, which was perhaps the realization of these experiments in the studio with these objects, a kind of a more resolved, perhaps less interesting version with different sized objects producing different tones from 1969. Another sound-producing mobile. I'm going to move a little more quickly now for the sake of time. So this one strikes the iron hoop and it moves forward and back kind of seductively, like a cinematic experience. So you wouldn't realize it's a noise mobile just from looking at it. It's kind of a noise mobile was the term that he used. A work from 1940, a very quiet noise-making mobile. He produced about 4 dozen of these noise-making mobiles and continued making them over the course of his life. Another one that he mentioned, creating these kind of incidental noises from the elements at the bottom, which collides, is called dogwood. In the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, he started sort of formalizing these mobiles, and the strikers became these sort of protruding lead pieces on these thin wire tentacles, and these are these brass gongs, and they're just extraordinarily elegant. Okay, so this is a composer who was part of the so-called New York School. Earl Brown was a big fan of Calder. He loved literature. He was interested in James Joyce, Stefan Meyer-May, also artists like Jackson Pollock. He talked a lot and wrote a lot about his direct inspiration from Calder. And in 1952, he made this score. So graphic notation was borrowing from the visual arts, and it looks kind of like a Mondrian. And the idea is that you read the score, you play any instrument that you like, it's open. And you read it from left to right, I believe. I could be wrong, maybe it's in any direction. But you have to imagine that you're moving through space and that you interpret the blocks of sound with your particular instrument dynamically, and in terms of volume and in terms of timing, it's very open. So it was a revolutionary idea This is some sound of David Tudor interpreting this score solo. Other instances of this idea of mobile form. 25 pages for 1 to 25 pianos. It's left to the performer to decide which order to play these pages. So you determine in advance the actual sequence of the music. And the idea here that Brown was borrowing from Calder was that there's this structure underpinning everything that is mobile, that you make a decision of sequence, you leave an aspect of it open. And there was a political aspect of this that was going on at the time, of giving more agency to the performer rather than just kind of being an empty vessel that had to interpret the music from the performer, and against the idea that all the music was sort of embedded in the score. So against this sort of sacredness of the score. And so back to this idea of a mobile composition, of things being left to the performer to change the elements in particular order, in particular shape. Morton Feldman was another member of this New York school, also very close to visual artists. And another really interesting early piece of graphic notation. It says copyright 1962. It's actually written in 1951. And the timbre, the register, the time is indicated. It can be performed on any instrument. I wish I could spend more time sort of sharing with you some analysis of each of these particular scores, but I don't. And it's sort of a big history of the wake of these people who are thinking about this idea of mobility. So these composers in America participated in seminars in the summertime in Darmstadt in Germany. And they shared these ideas that were simmering at the time. And they just spread like wildfire. So this idea of dispersing these composed components, and everyone kind of latched onto it because it was a new idea. And this word mobile became adopted into the musical language. So they're seeking references to kind of authorize and describe these new musical articulations and non-cloistered expressions that felt close to their new compositions. So a lot of these composers found the word mobile very handy to describe what they're interested in doing. Just to give you a kind of visual reference back to Calder's mobiles. This is from a show at the New Gallery at MIT in 1950. Another composer, German composer, Stockhausen, who adopted these ideas. This is a detail of another piece where the performer chooses a musical passage and then has choice of where to move to next, of which part of the score to perform. This guy is interesting. He made a piece of tape music, meaning he cut up magnetic tape on reels. When you think of the technology at the time, it was years before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band when the Beatles took two 4-track tape machines and linked them together so that they could have more tracks to record onto, to hear sound simultaneously. So he made this piece of music called Scambi, correspondences of sounds kind of leading into one another, and it's left up to the composer who has access to the physical tape to determine the sequencing of the sounds. I think there are 18. I don't have it in front of me, but 18 different recorded sequences of sound. So this is Henri Pousseur's version of Scambi. Just another composer. There's so many of them because the idea of mobile form or open form composition was really being digested at this time, and so everyone kind of wanted a piece of it and to try radical ideas in different ways and see how far they could stretch this idea. So this is a piece of flute music, and the vertical lines actually are moments when the performer can choose, sort of a game of snakes and ladders, to ascend or to descend into a different phrase. Very kind of playful attitude toward the score. And there are just loads and loads of these mobile compositions. This is an ongoing list from a scholar named Marina Pereverzeva, and it's a compilation of a lot of these pieces that just use the word mobile or mobiles or Calder mobiles or mobiles after Calder. So it really made an impact. This is Aula Magna. Calder had a lot of different projects. There were Sonic Arts projects. Too many to list here, really. But this is a very significant one of acoustic reflective panels in Caracas, Venezuela at University City. So a really amazing solution to the acoustics of a hall, which then proved to be one of the most sonically pleasurable halls in the world. So Leonard Bernstein said it was his favorite hall acoustically that he'd played in South America on their tour. Calder wanted these elements, these clouds, or he would call them flying saucers sometimes, to be able to be adjustable on hinges and to move, and apparently they're fixed, unfortunately. But the idea is that the sound would be reflected and you would have a very different experience depending where you're sitting in the audience. So there's this architectural element as well, and this sort of sound of history brought into it. And it brings us to this work, The Whirling Ear, which was in the World's Fair in Brussels in 1958. So this is a pool in front of the US Pavilion, and that ear has a motor. So it moves, and the jets are choreographed as well. So you can imagine this as a very synesthetic experience. And this is another really extraordinary project. There was a collaboration between Calder's old friend Varese and the architects Le Corbusier and Yannis Xenakis, who's also a composer. And this was perhaps the most kind of grand example of sound really being moved in space with hundreds of loudspeakers. It's disputed how many precisely there were, but more than 300 of these loudspeakers located all over this building. And so Varese composed the music for this, just to relate it back to Calder's roots in his interest in sound moving in space and the mobility of sound. Here's a little segment of some of the music, which you'll have to imagine shifting through this vast cavernous double parabolic shape, intersecting parabolas. You can listen to the whole thing on YouTube. Another person moving sound in space, Stockhausen.
It's far away, and when it gets closer, it gets more clear. I wanted to have all that, to have a real impression of movement. I invented a table that rotates very easily, and I put loudspeaker in the center and 4 microphones at a 90-degree angle around the table. And these 4 microphones are connected with 4 channels of a 4-channel tape recorder.
Tingley, another a Swiss artist. There's briefly to get into his impact on sonic arts and people working with in sculpture. So these were called metamechanics, and there's a lot of noise happening in this sort of destruction, the literal destruction of this sculptural spectacle. Another segment of the video here. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit for the sake of time. This is just another example of choice-based music, of mobility to choose from one part to the next. Another composer who was interested in calling passages of his music mobiles a la Calder. So these are different mobiles for a string quartet that they choose passages from extemporaneously during the string quartet. So Earl Brown approached Calder in 1963, and Calder actually made him this standing mobile. And he called it Chef d'Orchestre, the conductor. And in 1966, Earl Brown had already been working on this score and imagining different colors of the elements for several years, and this red standing mobile arrived. And so Brown somewhat hastily remade the score so that it indicated instructions based on the movements of the mobile falling onto the score itself. So this is actually a page from the score for this percussion quartet of the pedals, as he called them, of the mobile falling into these different patterns. This is just something you would imagine happening. So you glance up at the sculpture and then you have to actually transpose it down onto the page. So this is from a performance I curated a few years ago. And they're striking the mobile as it's indicated in the score several times. This is the last time when they really set it in motion. And I love how aggressive it is. It's really meant to be performed this way. And it should always be performed this way. It wasn't devised to be something to be looked at. It was devised to be something to be looked at and played, listened to. And that whole thing is also available online on YouTube. It's about half an hour performance. Pendulum Music by Steve Reich, here with James Tenney, Richard Serra's on the left, then James Tenney, Bruce Nauman, and Michael Snow on the right. This is an important kind of piece of sound art where the performers hold these calibrated, these microphones over these, away from these speakers, they release them, and then it produces this feedback until they come to rest and they begin droning, then the power is cut. And again, if anyone's interested in pursuing any of these, particularly, it's all available online. Mobility in another form of the audience actually moving and having a spatial experience where the sound sources are shifting in choreographed and capricious manners. So this piece, Cassettes 100, was perhaps a kind of prototyping for another really incredible piece, Ugnayan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It means correlation. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Or it might not be, but there's a socio-political history, which I really don't have time to get into there, that's also quite important. But looking at the history of mobility opening up more and more and being incorporated in this manner in which there's this underlying structure, there's some kind of a proposal or a prompt by which improvised or not controlled elements can then take place and blossom inside of or because of. This installation was initiated by David Tudor, and in 1973 he collaborated with the members of a group called Composers Inside Electronics, creating Rainforest 5 Variation 1, and it was revisited in 2015 at MoMA. So there's a formal vocabulary, of course, influenced by Calder. And then we get to something very pared down, a kind of a hyper-concentrated spectacle for private audiences that the composer John Zorn, when he was very young, began giving to invited people at his home. And Theater of Musical Optics, it perhaps related to early experiences of seeing a Calder show at the Guggenheim in the early 60s. And I see a relationship to Cirque Calder, Calder's circus, of using ordinary objects, humble materials, found objects. Zorn was inspired by Jack Smith, using society's garbage, a way of sequencing and playing with materials and questioning what is music. So musical optics, in other words, seeing music, watching music, rather than sound, you're having this synesthetic suggestion or synesthetic experience, all very concentrated in this one table, this one centered place. And we'll come back to Zorn. Really interesting sculptor, Max Eastley, was working in the early 1970s, making these very rigorous sculptures that were inspired to a large degree by experimental film, visual music. People like the Whitney brothers, I see a relationship to Calder's small sphere and heavy sphere, the first hanging mobile, use of noise, mobility, an almost Japanese kind of appreciation for meditative moments, serenity. So the unpredictability of that object striking the gongs, just like in small sphere, heavy sphere, where there's tension in the line that's encouraging the beater to keep moving on its path, on its capricious path, with that sense of anticipation. When we don't hear the sound, the silences become just as important as the striking. So here's John Zorn again performing Cobra, which is one of his most famous pieces. He composed many of these pieces he called game pieces, and he didn't dictate what the players were playing. He provided cues, and he was pushing the meaning of structure and mobility.
Ready?
So with that complex score, you see the performers' personalities coming out, and everyone becomes an instrument, or everyone becomes the music. You're watching people as instruments. There's this incredible kind of anarchy going with this structure, and they become this sort of temporary community. And that's one of the things that's so amazing about it. And around the same time in New York on the Lower East Side, there was a composer, musician, and conductor, Butch Morris, who invented this type of sound painting he called conduction. So he's actually, so Butch here is using the content that the performers are providing. Content's such a bad word now with digital technology and streaming, but all the musical content, he's composing with it in real time. So he's determining the form. So in a sense, it's the inverse of a mobile, where he's determining the form as an improvisation as the performers are doing their thing. He's giving them signals. That's Shelley Hirsch, the vocalist. Zena Parkins is there on the harp too. Really amazing stuff. And finally, back to this idea of mobility in space with radios. So these are, this is a piece by Lucky Dragons, Luke Fishbeck and Sarah Rara, who collaborate. They're based in Los Angeles. And one of the works in an exhibition I curated at Ballroom Marfa was this piece for radio transmission over the town in West Texas. And so this music was coming on broadcast on an FM band, and you could hear it driving or walking through the town with the radio up to your ear, or driving around. You would hear the way that the bands would privilege one signal over another and violently break into another signal. And it was the sound of tuning forks, manipulated sounds from tuning forks. So you essentially were mobile and determined the piece of music. There was no final piece of music. You would hear the different recorded pieces being broadcast. And once again, this is available on YouTube, the whole video and Vimeo. And finally, because we're short on time, here are two artists, Christian Marclay and Kyung Lee, the cellist, actually intervening kind of violently, invited to do so with Calder's first hanging mobile, and adding additional objects to the sculpture in a series of performances at the Whitney. So Christian has added other things from modern life, Monster energy drink can. And we kind of come full circle here. So I'm going to wrap at that point with my abbreviated history. And thank you all for listening. We're going to enter into a conversation and Q&A.
Thank you, Gryphon. That was great. And everyone is welcome to submit questions into the chat section. I wanted to start with asking about an impression that I had working in the gallery on the installation of Calder-Picasso. We have the beautiful mobile dispersed objects with brass gong, which is very similar to the double gong and triple gong works that you showed just now in your presentation. And as all of you may be able to tell from the presentation today or visiting the gallery, you don't know when the striker might or might not, if ever, hit the mobile and create a sound. And so it reveals, like all these works, I think, something inherent and intrinsic about his work, which is the presence of time and tempo and duration. But people often describe Calder mobiles as making things visible that are otherwise invisible. He talks about making the universe visible. You can't see it, you have to imagine it. But I wanted to ask you about the idea that he's actually making silence visible and or found sounds that happen in the gallery as well, which is more akin to somebody like John Cage in 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And I wonder what your impressions are about Calder in silence as opposed to the active presence of sound, the negative or positive presence of silence.
Well, Cage kind of made silence his calling card, and funny enough, I compressed so many things into this presentation, and I didn't include Cage for a few different reasons. He's so famous and well known, and just bursting with so many ideas, and he doesn't explicitly borrow from Calder. He has a lot of roots in indeterminacy, which is a different thing than mobility and mobile form. And the organization of sound, which comes from Varese, and you can see here in small sphere and heavy sphere, is different than pure chance or I Ching derived music and so forth. So silence with Calder is very different than with Cage. There's a very sharp distinction between 433 and small sphere and heavy sphere. In 433, there's movements which are indicated by the opening and closing of the piano, keyboard, And the time supposedly is chance derived of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That's disputed. But the music or sounds happen as a kind of the onrush of the sound from the audience, from all of the sounds. Everything is incorporated into that piece of music. So it's not a silent piece. And Cage famously said there's no such thing as silence. And that's a whole kind of rabbit hole. But Calder was interested in the tension created between those moments when the striker is colliding with those objects. So he called them impediments, impedimenta. And they're impediments to the silent path of the striker. And so that tells you something about his intention, that it wasn't about making a lot of noise. It wasn't about creating lots of sonic events. It was about creating disparity and a kind of like a Newtonian piece of chance music. So he set it up to be set in motion, and then you hear your inner gears, so to speak, of anticipating the ball to strike the objects or the noise mobile in the air to have a collision, because you just want to hear it happen because it's not happening. So there's a sharp distinction there. Perhaps it's closer to something like what Thelonious Monk said about silence being the actual music or between the notes. So
Miles Davis, yeah, the notes you don't play.
Right.
Yeah, great. This one requires specific knowledge, which I don't have, but somebody asked, do you see a connection between the visual composition of experimental scores and visual compositions in softwares like GarageBand? I don't know if that's knowledge that you have.
What a great question. I mean, when I was in graduate school, there was a lot of discussion about the suggestiveness of software programs, all of them, Ableton or Reason or Logic or Pro Tools or GarageBand, they all have a lot of suggestiveness, which is subconsciously telling you certain things about the kind of music you should be making. They're all linear. Some of them try to get away from that, particularly like things like Reaper or things that are usually used for electronic music. And so I think there is a connection there with graphic scores. There are graphic scores which I didn't show, which are more democratic, that are not mobile form or open form, like some of the Fluxus scores, a piece by Toshi Ichiyanagi for Merce Cunningham. There's a piece, pieces that are very open. The closest thing I would say to a software program which is not suggestive would be like Earl Brown's December 1952. But the blocks in space, and also the things that you're probably thinking about on YouTube, where you see representations of scores like Georgi Ligeti's scores or Yanis Xenakis' scores. Often you're hearing the music and it's scrolling through the graphic notation and you're listening to it as it's unfolding. There's still this suggestion of linearity there. So we haven't really found a way to escape linear time-based music making, which is really fascinating. So I think that there's a graphic similarity, but there's also some similarities in the suggestiveness of the software with the graphic scores.
And then someone asked, how has this historical narrative of sonic arts that you outlined tonight impacted your own creative process, either in terms of influences or whether or not you see yourself as part of that continuum or trying to break away from it?
That's a great question that I also chose not to include my own pieces, which at times directly engage or try to subvert aspects of this presentation. So I gave a performance, I can't remember if it was 2014 or 2015, which incorporated some of Calder's scraps, which actually borrowed from his studio. So there were things that were not sculptures. There was like detritus. and I called it Vertical Foliage Orchestra. So I tried to directly engage by improvising with the scrap material. And I find myself more inspired by forms of collage these days in particular, and montage. And something like the John Zorn musical optics, theater of musical optics, I find really fascinating for its kind of close-up magic feel. So the thing that's influenced me, I think, is the sense of a happening in Calder, which goes back to his circus. So for me personally, in my musical practice, I resonate most with the circus and Sir Calder's close-up magic aspect, the way that it all takes place with very humble materials. And it's just baffling that you can do so much just with a record playing and a large man in a red shirt speaking in really poor French, moving bits of cork and little pieces around and creating a whole universe. So that's the aspect that I actually see influencing my work the most.
Great. Well, we're at time, but I want to thank Gryphon Rue for the really interesting outline of modernism in experimental music, and of course, Calder's work as well. We are in our last weekend here for the Calder-Picasso exhibition, but as was noted earlier, we have wonderful exhibitions as well at the Legion of Honor, including Last Supper in Pompeii and Wangechi Mutu. But thank you, Gryphon, so much for joining us tonight. And we really appreciate all the insights you've been able to offer about both Calder, obviously, but more importantly, about the history of music and sound and silence.
Can I say one last thing before we go?
Absolutely.
So in my preamble, I was thinking to myself, if there's anyone out there who wants to help me try and subvert the sort of narrative that I delivered tonight or complicate it in some way, and kind of work on that project with me. It's a growing, developing thing that I've been researching for years now, but I'm totally open to collaboration around it. So you can find me, just my name at gmail.com, and we can have a further discussion.
Great. Collaboration is great. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much to Gryphon Rue and Tim Burgard. I'm so excited to say that our museums are now open. Capacity is limited and Calder-Picasso is sold out. But please check our website for more information about the other wonderful exhibitions on view now at the De Young Museum and the Legion of Honor. You can book your tickets in advance at tickets.famsf.org. And thank you so much for your support. We will see you next week.